Hi everyone. I am Sarah. I'm a paediatric registrar currently working at Chelsea and Westminster and ED. And the reason I'm talking about this topic is one, I'm very passionate about migrant children, migrant issues in general, migrant health. And I've worked with various migrant groups since pre-ST1 in pediatrics. I worked in Egypt with detained migrants and trafficked migrants, and not specifically children, but all ages, and other vulnerable groups in various organizations. And then since I've come back, I've worked with Doctors of the World for a couple of years, and I've continued to do sort of some research and advocacy work on this. So hopefully something I know a fair bit about, but please interrupt. I know there's a few experts as well in this group who are listening in, so please interrupt. So this, I've tried to focus on safeguarding issues, so it's not covering sort of a typical talk on you ask health needs, which was covered by Emma, I think a couple of weeks ago, and hopefully, I don't know if it was recorded or not, but that was done 2 weeks ago, so I'm not going to go over that. I'll just give you a very quick overview of sort of health needs, but nothing more detailed. It's more covering the why do we need to, what are the safeguarding issues that are very specific to certain migrant groups, and what do we need to know about them? Now, before I start, are there any specific topics or questions that people want answered, or things they want covered? Okay. So I'll tell you what I'll be covering. So I'll just give a very quick, this is a very basic context. A few slides just on how sort of how I think about health, the health of migrants, if I've got a migrant in front of me in clinic or in A&E or wherever. And then the big two focus areas will be trafficked children and trafficking in general, and healthcare access in the UK, and I'll explain why that has some relevance to safeguarding as well. So, quick context. So just a few numbers thrown out there, but essentially it's just to show that there's loads and loads and loads of children who live as in sort of potentially vulnerable situations. So over 13 million children who live as refugees or asylum seekers outside of their country of birth. So that doesn't include any internally displaced children and families. And that a large number of children on the move are unaccompanied or separated from their caregivers. And this is just rough estimates at a particular time. It's high. It's likely to be high, much higher number. This is an estimate for Europe. And most of these children, although we talk about the European sort of refugee crisis, but most children and refugees and asylum seekers live in low and middle income countries. They live in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. In terms of the UK, these numbers might not be fully up to date, but there's only a few thousand unaccompanied asylum-seeking children at any one point, most times. But there is also an estimated nearly 150,000 undocumented children, and I'll explain what that means. And half of those children have been born in the UK. So some definitions, and normally this is a much more interactive session, but some of these things I'll just have to run through because it's quite difficult on GoBeat. So the difference between asylum seekers and refugees. Asylum seeker is a person who is in the process of determining their refugee status, so are seeking asylum and are asking for the country they're in to recognize them as refugees. And if refugee is a person who's been found by that country to be in need of protection. So that's the main difference, essentially. So asylum seekers are still in the process. Refugees have sort of finished that process, at least for a period of time. And then undocumented migrants, and I said I would explain what that means. It's a very large umbrella term, and I've used undocumented on purpose. And in the news, you would often hear more sort of illegal migrants, irregular migrants, etc. But these all have very negative connotations to them. So undocumented just explains that they just don't have the documentation to be legally staying in the country. And it's essentially someone who's in breach of their immigration rules. And for children, the kinds of people who might find themselves in those situations are refused asylum seekers. And in the UK, very high percentage of those who seek asylum get refused initially, and then some of it gets reversed on appeal. Some have to reapply with a different sort of having additional information added to their case. So it's quite it's not unusual for asylum seekers to get refused, at least not at the start. So it's quite a common scenario. EEA citizens who are not exercising their treaty rights, or sort of technical immigration things, people who previously had leave to remain, but this has run out, so someone who's overstayed their visa, and so the children of people without leave to remain. So any parent who doesn't have leave to remain for whatever reason, their children, unless they have British citizenship through other ways, become their immigration status depends on their parents. And then there's all those who would be entitled to citizenship or would be entitled to some other avenue of regularizing their status, but they can't afford to do that, or haven't gone through the process because they don't know. Mostly they can't afford it. So mostly the fees are in the several thousands each application. So just very quickly, sort of framework for thinking about health of a migrant child if you've got someone in front of you, of how do you frame it, how do you think about their health needs, and how can you sort of organize it in your head. And the way I've always organized it in my head is thinking of their journey. So the pre-departure, so where they've come from, the journey itself, which is all the transit countries they've been through and how the journey went, and where they've arrived. And all of these things, their health will be highly influenced by experiences of trauma, the health of their caregivers, and the ability to access healthcare. And that's why at the end I'll talk a lot about access to healthcare. So let's talk about a case. So this is a case, this is somewhat fictional, but I've seen several young boys like him with very similar stories. So Hassan is 15, he's Kurdish, Syrian Kurds, and essentially his father managed to get enough money to send him to Europe, and probably it was quite a long journey, we don't know. He arrived first in Lesbos, was identified as a minor and held in Moira. These are all sort of refugee camps. And then was placed in a hosting center in Athens. And then from there, he continued his travels up the Balkan route to Calais. And after 3 months, he managed to come to the UK. Since arriving, he's been living with friends. That's all you know. And he comes to your ED with suicidal ideation. His friends found him at home with packets of paracetamol. So I'm going to try and make this slightly interactive. What are your first priorities and what are your main concerns?
First priority, has he had any of the paracetamol, or is all of them the unopened packets with him?
So we'd have to check with him. So friends have found unopened packets, but we don't know whether he's got some others that have gone in the bin or some. So yes, we need to check that. Someone said safety. Would anyone elaborate on safety?
Safety, maybe we'll be saying age of friends. Who are these friends? Are they the same age as him? And like the house they're living, are there adults present there, or is it just all of them similar ages like him? So I think when you talk of safety, that's what you'll be thinking. Who are these friends? What are their ages?
Yeah, perfect. And Sarah says, first priority is to treat as any other young person with suicidal ideation. So yes, we need to address his mental health issues and his suicidal ideation. But I don't know who it was who said we need to really find out who he lives with, what are their ages, who's looking after him, and then what else should be running through your heads. Let's say he's living with another 3 boys who are 17 to 18.
I'll be thinking, do they have any contact with social services? Who is caring for them? How did they come to the country? What are their origins? Are they also from outside the UK? So are they immigrants as well? So I'll be wanting to know their background a bit more.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we need to, so I think that the first thing you said about knowing if they're known social services is really quite important. So essentially, he's an unaccompanied minor, and he may or may not have registered as an unaccompanied minor. So he might not be an asylum seeker. So we might be making assumptions about his the process he's gone through, but he basically gone through that process and have sort of avoided social services and avoided the Home Office, because there is a lot of they hear lots of stories of children being treated as adults and being refused and being deported, etc. So it's very common for this to happen, unfortunately. So what else is being said? That yeah, it's not ideal, but it's probably the case with many asylum seekers. So yes, if they are unaccompanied asylum seekers living in a sort of sheltered accommodation, that would be a very different scenario. But if you've got a child who's not known to any services, living with some other children, essentially, or young people, that's definitely a concern and something we should be addressing. And then the question of, could there be any criminal sexual exploitation from these others? Absolutely. And the other thing we need to wonder is, how is he living? He's only 15. Where does he have any money? What food has he got? Is he, all these other basic things that he needs to have access to. So absolutely. So obviously so this is just summarizes what we just said. And I just also put a table of the other things that I would think about if I met a child like him, trying to think a bit more broadly other than your typical history, other things to think of. So in each of these sections, the pre-departure, transit and destination, there's access to healthcare, which is very important for each. So what they've had in terms of healthcare, if they've had vaccinations, if they've had, when they were traveling, if they got injured, did they manage to go to a hospital, etc. All of these things are really relevant. And then experiences of violence, torture, war, imprisonment, all these sort of things that will have a massive effect. Any types of bereavement, and how their parents were coping and the family was coping in general. And in transit, again, similar things. The other thing to think about is young people who are traveling so mostly traveling through the European route and any route really would mostly travel at night. So they sleep during the day and they travel at night. So that creates very strong sleep disturbances, as well as obviously other psychological issues and being very fearful of others and generally on high alert. And then loss of family or friends along the way. So along the routes, often people get separated for various reasons, and that can be very traumatic as well. And not just their family, but friends they've met along the way. And experiences of imprisonment, refoulement, where they get sent back to where they've just come from, which can happen back and forth quite a bit, and threats of deportation. And then when they arrive, it's not the end of the road. Are they accessing any support? Do they have routes to legalize their immigration status? Have they got access to basic sort of essentials? And what's their experience of racism or rejection? Have they found a community that's accepting of them? Have they found their tribe? And all of these things will have massive impacts on how they manage. And just the other thing that I wanted to say is to just remember, when you meet these young people, they can be very assertive, they've gone through quite a lot, but that doesn't mean survival skills are not the same as daily life skills. So don't assume that the confident 15-year-old who's done the journey from Syria all the way to the UK has the ability to cook healthy food for themselves, manage money, or just negotiate the adult world. And this I'm not going to play now because it's quite long, but it's just to give you the link of a sleep disturbances video that's really useful, that gives has the voice of the young people who've traveled, and then talk through different tips they've found of how to help with their sleep disturbance. And this is a book I'd recommend everyone to read. It's so this man, Gulwali Pasarley, he was going to talk at our RSM Safeguarding Day, which unfortunately is now not happening. But he's absolutely inspirational and brilliant. And this book is of his story, of his journey from Afghanistan to the UK. And it has a lot of it describes the journey and all the complexities of it. And also arriving in the UK and the difficulties there and being age disputed, etc. So a lot of the issues come out in this book, and it's brilliant. So let's go to slightly more. So we've talked about the possibility that this child is being exploited, and that would be my sort of top worry of, you know, he's living there. Clearly, the people who are allowing him to live there are benefiting somehow. So that would be my biggest worry. So trafficking. So trafficking is so the and human trafficking is a bit more of a technical term. And the definition is quite long, but essentially what you need to know is that it's where you're recruiting, transporting, or taking a person and exploiting them. So for children, you don't need to have coerced them, used force, threats, fraud, deception, none of the. You don't need to lie to them or do anything. If you sort of recruited them for exploitation, that's human trafficking. So what forms of human trafficking are you aware of in the UK?
So working in restaurants or like the nail salons and those places.
Yeah, absolutely. Working in farms, yeah. Any thoughts on things that are fairly common in children?
Drug trafficking?
Drug trafficking, yeah, and county lines, so that's a form of trafficking.
Child labour is another.
Child labour, yeah. So in the UK, young people are recruited, obviously in all sorts of settings, but one of the fairly common one that's been going on for quite some time is for cannabis cultivation, and that affects particularly Vietnamese young boys. And it's something that's been ongoing for quite a long time. So that's just one of the very typical one. Okay, I think we've covered a fair bit, but essentially, yes. So criminal exploitation, as I said, cannabis cultivation, pickpocketing, begging, moving drugs, sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, any other exploitative labor. So you've mentioned most of these things: nail bars, salons, restaurants, factories, car washes, fisheries, farms, etc. Forced marriage is now recognized as well as a form of trafficking. And informal fostering arrangements where they're using the child for benefit fraud or immigration fraud, and then other sort of darker ones of illegal adoption, removal of organs, which are less common, hopefully. So just quickly on myths, things that might often get mixed and not understood very well. So trafficking and smuggling are different things. They can be, so if you're being smuggled somewhere, often there is a certain degree of violence involved, and it puts you at risk of being trafficked, especially if you're a child moving on your own. But just being smuggled to a different country, having paid someone to move you to a different country, does not constitute trafficking. These two words are used completely interchangeably in the media, but they're very different things. So the smugglers are just sort of, you know, getting the money up front and then fulfilling what they said they would do, but there is no exploitation involved. Trafficking doesn't require transportation crossing of borders, so it can happen within your own country. And as such, it doesn't only happen to immigrants or foreign nationals. It doesn't require physical force, physical abuse, or any other sort of restraint. And actually, most of the cases I've met and I've worked with, physical force and physical abuse is a small part of their experience, and it's often at the start of the experience, as a way of sort of creating a relationship of control and where there is fear. but with time, the main thing that's used is sort of emotional manipulation and control, and threats to family, threats to that person, and lots more complex ways of controlling someone rather than physical force. And the consent of the victims is relevant. So this is more obvious in if we're talking about county lines. If you've got an 11-year-old who has gone and found a gang and said, I'm going to work for you for whatever, for moving drugs, the fact that they've consented is completely irrelevant. And that was the same. It's the same with child sexual exploitation. And it was the issues of young girls who were being exploited, and every time they went to the police, they were being told where you consented to it or you wanted this. But we have to remember that with children, you cannot consent to being exploited. So globally, these numbers are to show why human trafficking is extremely difficult to combat, and it's a bit depressing, but it's our role, we have to remember, is to identify people who might have been trafficked and support them. So there is several millions, 40 something million people worldwide who are thought to be trafficked, and it generates about 150 billion US dollars per year. So it's massive business. And most trafficking is into forced labor and forced marriage. The common narrative before was that most trafficking is into sexual exploitation, but that's actually not the case in most countries, sorry. And depressingly, overall worldwide, 1 in 4 victims are children. So it's very relevant to us. In the UK, current sort of estimates of numbers. So the NRM, National Referral Mechanism, is the system by which the UK gets referral for potential victims of trafficking. And since its inception a few years back, they've been having year-on-year increases in referrals. And 2 years ago, their referral numbers were so nearly 7,000 potential victims referred to them. And of these, 3,000 were children, so quite a high percentage, about 40%, really, really high. And this is only obviously the tip of the iceberg, and the figures are thought to be in the tens of thousands. And over 50% were into sort of different forms of forced labor. And if you look at the top 5 countries of origin of victims, anything that shocks you or surprises you? Yeah. Any thoughts why that might be?
Could have been from the sexual grooming cases of girls being moved from one county to another.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, so it's starting to include county lines and child sexual exploitation. So absolutely. And someone asked whether they're children of migrants, those in the UK, and that, we know that ethnic minority groups are at higher risk of all sorts of things. So whether they're at higher risks of child sexual exploitation or county lines, absolutely. That shouldn't really be that shouldn't be the case, but it is probably. And it's easier to traffic with no immigration borders. That is absolutely true. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of unaccompanied young people from Albania and Vietnam in London. We know that, and often they move a lot, and a lot of them disappear, sort of get found, end up in foster care, and then disappear quite quickly after. And when they disappear is often when we worry that they're being trafficked. And it's quite a big concern and something that a lot of organizations are working on. So I'm going to just get some water. Okay. So as I said, our role, so it's all very depressing. I'm sorry, it's the evening and everything. It's not a cheery topic, but we have to, so there is something we can do. It's all very depressing. And if you think of the whole infrastructure of trafficking, it seems like it's impossible to dismantle and so depressing. But if we can identify potential victims or someone, you know, who's particularly vulnerable, and give them a voice and support them, that can make a huge difference in that person's life. So we have to believe that there is a massive difference we can do. So how there isn't any, unfortunately, easy, so there's all these sort of toolkits with tick boxing and red flag signs, and you know, people have come up with all sorts of different things. This is my one, and I'm sure there's better ones, but there's an easy way of recognizing someone is being trafficked. I think about it is if I've got a child in front of me and they have anything that sort of triggered my mind saying, you know, there's something a bit odd about that story, or there is something odd about them, and there may be some physical signs or something in the way they've presented to us, because obviously it's healthcare, and there is something that tells you that they're being controlled. So there's someone there with them, speaking on their behalf, not letting them speak. If the patient's not speaking it's not speaking English, if they seem fearful, vigilant, if they look like they're checking their story with the person next to them, or they're telling you a scripted story, anything that sort of gives you a feel that they're being controlled, should make you think of a possible trafficking situation. And ultimately, the biggest thing is if something feels not right, go with that. So red flags, this is not an exhaustive list in any way, but it's just a few things that we see. So sort of inconsistent or scripted history, and a lot of it is very common with any kind of child protection presentation. But people unable to give their address, or who don't know which city they live in. And I've met lots and lots and lots of people who've been trafficked who manage to escape, and they end up in somewhere at a hospital or at a clinic and have no idea where they really are. They might have a vague clue, but not really. And if you ask for their address, they have no idea. And it often, because often there is a lot of disbelief, and we wonder if they're hiding something, and that, you know, there may be reasons why they don't want to give their address, but you do need to just explore that a bit more, and take it seriously potentially. Obviously, late presentations, carrying large amounts of cash, appearing younger than their stated age. Often people will have had to change their passport to travel, so to be an older age than they actually are. You know, anything to suggest sexual exploitation. And the other thing to highlight is like drug and alcohol addictions. This is a way of controlling victims. So if you see children, I know we see, you know, in adult ED, at least 16 and 17-year-olds come sometimes with alcohol intoxication, or having taken weed or other drugs. And it's sort of often brushed off as typical teenage things, but we need to just explore that further and make sure there's nothing else. And the typical physical signs, so unfortunately there isn't typical physical signs. They don't come with signs of physical trauma very often. They don't come with, you know, STIs very often. It's often more subtler things. And even if there is physical trauma, most of the people I've met, it was sort of lots of small old scars, sort of hidden under the hair, or, you know, not in obvious places, not necessarily obvious things. One of, just tell you a depressing case, but a child I'd met when I worked in Egypt, who was 16 at the time. I met her because she was detained under immigration law, and we were asked to intervene to try and see if we could help her get back home. Clearly not what we wanted to do, but anyway, so we went and interviewed her, and she was sort of wearing something around her head. She had sort of, you could see small cuts under her scarf, and she was looking down. She was quite withdrawn and sad, and the only reason I got any sort of story out of her was because I spoke French, and her country of origin, in her country of origin, they also spoke French. So she managed to open up, and she told me that she's been employed for several years by this Egyptian family, and they are horrible to her, and she tried to run away, but the police brought her back to them again, and then she finally ran away again, but has been taken to immigration detention. And it's really, you know, when you first see her, they're all subtle things. There's nothing medically that obvious, but very, very subtle things. Just the way, her demeanor, and the tiny cuts. And the other thing, so her head covering was actually covering the fact that her head had been shaved. And this is one of the ways, particularly in domestic servitude, I've seen a lot of women who work as domestic workers having their hair shaved as a sort of vengeance from the woman who lives in the woman of the house, who feels that if she shaves her head, then the husband's not going to look at her, or something like that. This is obviously in very sort of Arabic cultures, but I'm sure it happens here as well. It's a way of control and a way of demeaning that person as well. So other physical signs. So this is quite you know, all these things are obvious, but what I want to say about the physical signs is that lots of recent research over the last few years has looked at the typical health concerns that victims of trafficking have had, and found that it's not what you necessarily expect of lots of STIs, lots of injuries, etc., but it's more very significant psychosomatic symptoms. So a lot of headaches and tummy aches and backaches and fatigue and tiredness, but they tend to have a lot of these symptoms, and they are very debilitating, so they're quite significant. So it makes it a lot harder for us to figure out, but if you have someone who's got a lot of these symptoms and just doesn't seem to be, can't get to the bottom of it, it's one of the things to think about. And again, sorry, this is quite a full slide, but just to show how strong the impact is of human trafficking, that it impacts their physical health, and you know, lots and lots of things can happen, and often they'll have, as I said, lots of fatigue and GI symptoms and headaches, but also they'll have teeth problems and skin problems, and then might have had pregnancies or abortions. But the things to that are quite important to remember is their behavioral consequences. So they will have very significant attachment and identity issues. Often these children or adults who've been trafficked have had multiple life traumas. So they're often people who have, for example, come from a country of poverty or from a situation of poverty, might have lost parents, might have had emotional abuse or physical abuse as a child, or you know, often they've had one thing after another, so they've gone from a bad situation to another that led to eventually being exploited to that degree. So they'll have significant mistrust of adults. They often will have antisocial behaviors, but not always. Addiction problems. They can have dependency on their abusers, because at least it's something they know. And they can be angry and aggressive, and they will have a lot of memory problems, and this is really significant. When they, and some research has shown that the way they the connections in the brain to try and form the story of what's happened to them get something, I haven't got the technical term for it, sorry, but essentially something gets changed and they can't remember in the same sort of linear way that we think of. So if you hear a story that doesn't quite make sense, that sort of jumps from one thing to the other, and you can't get a timeline, it's not because they're trying, it's not because they're lying or they're inventing the story. That's just that's how the bits of the memory comes out. In terms of mental health problems, they're really significant. So they have a lot of PTSD, and quite complex PTSD, and then all the other typical things you'd expect, so depression, suicidal thoughts, and potential suicide, committing suicide, and lots of guilt, low self-esteem, and they have a lot of shame, lots of mood swings and paranoia. So, sorry, let's talk about another case. So you're in ED again, you see Samia. She's a 12-year-old girl from Eritrea. She's accompanied by her uncle. She looks withdrawn and sort of sad, and her eyes are down. She's not speaking directly at you. You You can see that she's thin, she has dry skin, she complains of abdo pain, and uncle says that she's been living with him since she came to the UK and her parents had to stay back in Eritrea. What would you, so I'm not going to go back to where are the red flags on this one. I think the red flags being that we don't know. So let's say they're not then he's not officially her guardian, so they've not gone to social services, he's not her foster care, and she's not speaking directly to you, so you're worried. So let's try and think of practical things we can do. How can you get the uncle to leave the room? What sort of sentences can you say? And then if you do manage that, what questions might you ask her?
I mean, for me, for any child kind of above the age of 10 or 11, I always offer to examine them on their own. And I will ask them dad and sometimes even the mom to leave the room. So that's kind of part of the routine for me by now. So it doesn't matter what ethnicity they are.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts?
I think if there was any resistance to that person leaving the room or leaving the child alone, that's a red flag in itself.
Brilliant. So 2 really good points. So if we make it a standard practice, the same as it's standard practice for us to ask in our history, are you known to social services? If you make it standard practice for any teenage child, so young person over the age of 10, 11, whatever feels appropriate, depending on the child, that you examine the child on their own. And it should be done in a way where you're not saying, I need to ask your child or this child questions on their own, because that raises a lot of alarm bells. It's just about saying, now I'm going to examine them as they are old enough. I normally ask you to step out and I'll get one of my nursing colleagues to be in with me as a chaperone. And that's a fact. And then there is no, it's not a, you're not offering, you're not suggesting, you're not giving them the option of saying no. Clearly, there are times when that's not going to work, and there is a, you know, we're not going to start having an argument with the uncle there. That just raises a red flag and makes you start to think, okay, I need to dig deeper, but you're not going to be able to have a fight about that. So that's not going to go well. So if you get her on her own, how can you start approaching her and asking her questions?
Ideally, you'd want to keep it open-ended and get her to start opening up her story without kind of homing in on points that you want to specifically maybe get, but kind of keep it open, essentially.
Yeah. Janani says, probably wouldn't jump directly into suspicions. Absolutely. Ask about abdominal pain first and then take it from there. Absolutely. Yeah, so always, so they've come with a health concern, so you have to address that. You can't just brush that aside because you've got all these other worries. And starting from the medical things can help you get to the questions you really want to ask. So if you check her tummy and then you make a comment of, oh, you seem quite thin, you know, what do you eat normally? That can start a conversation. What sort of foods do you like? Yada yada. And you can say, you know, and then you can ask about if they look like, there's all sorts of openers that can make you ask questions that are non-threatening. So essentially you need to get build a report, ask questions that are non-threatening, that are not going to frighten her right away, and tell her that this is a safe space to talk. So things that I found useful, so is to always, as I said, start with things that are more general and more health related. The other thing that I find quite useful, this is a list that comes from the NSPCC Child Trafficking something website. is quite useful. But one of the things that I find really useful is to ask about things like food and things like where they sleep, when they last went to the doctor or anything like that. And if you ask, so I had a woman at Doctors of the World who had come, who was pregnant, who had left a trafficking situation. So she gave us that story, had left a trafficking situation. Then someone picked her up from the street and offered to host her. And it was all like, the story was said to us as, you know, that this person is really helping me and she's given me a roof over my head and I'm really grateful, yada, yada. But when I then went on to ask about access to food in the home she's at, she said that she couldn't help herself with food, and the woman she was living with was leaving a piece of bread and cheese twice a day. And so obviously, it's these small things that are not threatening that then make you certain of actually. So then what transpired is that this woman who had opened her door to her essentially employed her as a domestic servant. And that was, to her, that was her way of repaying, giving her a roof over her head. But obviously she wasn't being paid. She was sleeping on the floor. She couldn't go to her antenatal appointments because the woman had, you know, was saying, you can go, you've got like, you can go once every so many months, or you're only allowed to be out of the house for half an hour, or that kind of thing. So it's these non-threatening questions that can give you the most clues as to what's actually going on. So, sorry, if you've got this person with you, so that the immediate actions are to make sure that you're in a safe place, your patient is safe, and that your department's safe. So if you're thinking about quite a serious trafficking scenario, for example, cannabis exploitation, or something that's really well organized, you could be putting your department at risk or yourself at risk if you start asking threatening questions, or the person there who's accompanying starts to figure out that you could be about to call the police. So that could put you seriously at danger. So the way to make sure that you're safe is to never ask questions related to your suspicions in front of the person accompanying them. Find ways to talk to the person alone, and use professional interpreters if you need to. And then the other thing I've written here, this is more for adults, is I give this teaching for both adults and children, but it's to not call the police authorities right away without consent of the patient. So if they're an adult, they have to consent unless there is an immediate danger to life, because they should be empowered and they should be the ones making the decision. For a child, obviously, you're going to have to report, you're going to have to inform authorities, but you need to involve them in that decision. You need to keep them in the loop. So it's not something that just happens to them like everything else that's happened to them in their life. It needs to be something collaborative, and you need to involve them. And the way that happens, you know, you should ask the child how they would like that to happen. If there is things that can be adapted, so if they want someone particular to be there with them, or those sorts of things. So we need to give as much choice as possible. So I'm going to skip that because I'm realizing I'm running out of time. This is just a summary of what we said. So I want to quickly jump to, so this is what these are, where you refer to. So children get referred to social services, and then social services refer to the national referral mechanism. If you speak to social services, always tell them that you're worried particularly about trafficking and the kind of trafficking you're worried about. And often I would advise to refer to also the NSPCC Child Trafficking Advocacy Advice Centre, because they can follow these cases and make sure that social services are equipped to make the right referral and write enough information for that child to be recognised, because it's quite a difficult process. And for adults, there's a modern slavery line, which is brilliant. That would be my first port of call. But your local safeguarding leads, Salvation Army also is the sort of first responder for the government for adults. So for us, the relevance of adults is we might have a pregnant woman who's just given birth and we think she's being trafficked, or a parent, any other parent. So the reason I want to quickly whiz through healthcare access in the UK at the moment is because access of care is will have a massive impact on the health of this child, sort of on your safeguarding issues. So it'll have a huge impact, and things have changed a lot over the last sort of 10 years. So I just wanted to give you a quick run through of how things have changed and what access people have and what that means for children and young people. So the barriers to access are the typical things you might expect: language barriers, lack of interpreters, administrative barriers, particularly for GP registration, where they always ask for proof of address and proof of ID. For someone who is here with no documentation, that's obviously quite tricky. And often proof of address means that you are renting officially and all of these sort of things. So they're absolutely impossible. Just so you know, there isn't actually a NHS England has made it very clear that this is not mandated. So GPs should still register patients who can't provide proof of address or proof of ID, but in practice, this often doesn't happen. And then there's lack of understanding of the system, and then there's the child I'll talk about. And the other thing that stops people from accessing care is the information sharing with the UK Home Office, and the NHS Digital shares information with the Home Office. Essentially, when they're looking for someone, they can contact. So there was a memorandum of understanding between them, and Home Office used to contact NHS Digital and ask for people's information. That has been stopped for now, but is going to restart at some point, I'm sure. But after a lot of campaigning, it was stopped. But there is still some information sharing with the Home Office, and I'll explain it. So just really quickly, essentially since 2014, lots and lots of things have changed in terms of who gets charged and how much they get charged. And essentially, the main thing is that in 2014, they changed the definition of what an ordinary resident is. So it's become linked to immigration status. And in 2015, they brought in the charging regulations, where anyone who's chargeable should pay 150% of the NHS tariff. So if something costs the NHS £100, they'll pay 150. And any debts of now I think it's £500 for 2 months or more get referred to the Home Office. So this is ongoing. This continues. And then there's immigration surcharge, where people who apply for a visa to work in the UK pay an extra fee to access NHS care. And this is something that's been in the news recently, because it's clearly, for example, it doesn't make any sense anyway, because people who apply for a work visa will be paying taxes like everyone else, or contributing anyway, and live in the country and contribute through all sorts of other ways. So they're double paying for the NHS. But also it means that it's become increasingly difficult to recruit nurses, because the surcharge is now £400, and it's about to jump to £625 per person per year. So if you're a nurse bringing in yourself, your husband, and your 2 kids, it becomes completely unaffordable to come just to work here. And then 2017, they brought up upfront charging, so where trusts are now mandated to charge upfront before treatment is provided, unless it's urgent or immediately necessary. So what can still be accessed for free is GP services, but as I said, there's a lot of barriers to that. NHS walk-in centres, minor injuries, A&E, NHS 111, family planning, but not abortions, and charitable palliative care services. So everything else essentially is chargeable, and that includes outpatient hospital care, community care, with the exception of school nurses and health visitors, I believe.
Wait, sorry, so if you come into hospital through A&E, then you have to be admitted for further care. So does that count like an acute A&E admission, or does that mean?
No, your admission is charged. So you don't get charged for your A&E attendance, because that will have a tariff, and whatever treatment was received in A&E, but once you're on a ward, you get charged. So exemptions, the exempt services we've talked about. Exempt patient groups are asylum seekers, refugees, children who are under the local authorities, and victims of trafficking, but only victims of trafficking who have been referred to the national referral mechanism and have been recognised as potential victims of trafficking. So that's a tiny, tiny minority of the actual number of victims of trafficking around. Exempt conditions include certain infectious diseases and any care given as a result for something that's as a result of torture, domestic violence, FGM, sexual violence. And that's something that very few people know, and is clearly no one's going to come and say, you know, I've got, I don't know, severe abdominal pain from trauma from domestic violence. That's just not how people present. But there is this exemptions, and it's up to us to figure it out and advocate for patients for them to have that exemption. So when do patients get charged? Since 2017, essentially they get charged before anything is provided unless it's immediately necessary or urgent. And the decision about immediately necessary or urgent is the clinical decision, but it's not always actually taken by clinicians. So in practice, a lot of it gets taken by admin staff, so overseas visitors managers, or it gets taken by sort of one person in the team, and it's not necessarily communicated along or discussed properly. But it should be a clinical decision. All maternity care is considered immediately necessary. So it means that they don't get charged for antenatal clinics and labour until they've given birth. But in reality, what actually happens is they start receiving bills very early on, as soon as they book the pregnancy, and quite threatening bills and sort of scary letters. So it feels like they should be paying in advance, but actually the rule is that they shouldn't pay until the end. A typical birth in the UK that's charged costs about £7,000. That's with no complications and nothing at all. So, without going into the politics of it, you might have sort of gathered that I'm obviously not very for these charging regulations, but we have done a survey last sort of, I've lost track of time now, nearly 2 years ago, of healthcare professionals working with children on their understanding of the regulations, their thoughts on it, and then has collected through that survey cases of people, what sort of healthcare professionals had seen of harm happening. And these are just some of the stories that came out. We had loads of stories. It's just been published just last month. I'm very excited about the findings. But essentially, it just shows that there is massive evidence of harm, that the regulations are unworkable, they're far too complicated, exemptions are not understood, it's almost impossible to find these exemptions. You need to have built rapport with a patient to find these exemptions. There's a lot of patients who shouldn't be charged who get charged. It creates a lot of fear, and obviously all of the cases that were reported to us were of children who had presented to hospital and had tried to get care. And it didn't capture at all the children who are completely avoiding care or adults who are avoiding care. And these are just some of the stories that we had. Oh, I've put the same one twice. I apologize. Didn't mean to do that. But this is one survey respondent said, I have seen some children, young people who are very sick as they have waited to seek help. This was a story that was quite depressing. This was a child who had presented to their local hospital quite late after waiting for fear of the bill, arrived quite sick, ended up on intensive care, was really, really quite sick. And then when on the first sort of official conversation with the parents, the medical team had booked an interpreter to speak to the family, and the overseas manager walked in on that conversation and essentially told the family that they needed to pay several tens of thousands up front. So the parents were very confused and obviously frightened and upset, and asked if they could take the child out of intensive care. Now, clearly that then becomes, for us as pediatricians, that becomes the safeguarding issues and it's clear ethical issues of, you know, you can't take your child out of intensive care, they might die. So what are these parents meant to be doing? You know, they're being told they have to pay for something up front, but we can't stop that treatment anyway. The other sort of stories we had is of families living in really quite terrible conditions, and I've seen that quite a lot at Doctors of the World as well, and not having access to enough money for food, etc., but parents begging for us not to refer to social services because of the fear of deportation. The other fear that's quite real is of children being found to be in such a dire state, but because social services can't provide housing to families who've got no immigration status or no recourse to public funds, they end up potentially, they could take the children away from their parents. This is obviously a very real fear. Any questions so far? Sorry, it's really depressing and it's Thursday evening, but what questions have you got?
Has that changed with COVID-19, or is there still upfront charges?
There is, unfortunately, there's been a lot of work, a lot of campaigning, and MPs have written letters to Secretary of State asking for the regulations to be stopped, at least temporarily, for COVID. The Royal College of Pediatrics, along with almost every other college, has also written to the Department of Health asking for the same thing. You know, there's been a lot of things, a lot of pressure on the government, and the government's a couple of times, I think, Parliament's been asked a couple of times, the question's been asked, and the response is just, well, we've put an exemption on COVID. But if someone comes with query COVID and they end up having something else, they're going to be charged. So it doesn't actually make any sense. And you can see in the current sort of public health emergency we're in that this will make public health issues worse. Any other questions or thoughts, or, you know, do I have any advice on getting involved, working, campaigning against this? Yes. So what can you do? Be informed. I'm not going to ask everyone to read the regulations. They're about 189 pages long, and they're really badly worded, some of them. But try and be informed. Assess your patients and look for exemptions and other vulnerabilities, and try and advocate for your patients. Don't be scared to say, actually, I think, you know, us talking to the overseas officers and saying, I think this patient should not be charged, or I think they've got an exemption, or I think we should approach this differently, is completely fine. And get involved. So to get involved, if you're interested, there's lots of different groups working on this. MedAct is one of them. I'll write them down here. MedAct, patient not, I don't know how to write. Sorry, it's not letting me write. I'll write it at the end. But MedAct is one, and I'm working with them. Patients Not Passports are another campaigning group. Doctors of the World, all their work is about advocating for these patients. These are the main sort of things groups I would tell you about. And in terms of references, so you'll see I've got for healthcare access, I've got the MedAct and Patients Not Passports have written a toolkit on charging for people who are interested. And there's a few other things. Reading your question, Ravi. So yes, something can be done for patients, for GPs who aren't registering patients. So if you look at, I should have put that as a reference, but if you look at NHS England GP registration guidance, let me try and if you quote that to a GP, saying it clearly states that you should still register them even if they don't have proof of address and proof of ID, that sometimes works. Sometimes speaking to the partner in that GP works, and other times it's just about finding another GP. Some areas have specialized GPs for homeless people who would welcome sort of similar patients, or for sort of vulnerable groups. And the other thing is to contact Doctors of the World. The UK, that's their bread and butter work, is essentially making sure that everyone is at least registered with GP. So they would do that as well. Great. Any other questions? I'm sure there's lots, or you're all very tired and depressed.
So how would you deal with a situation where like a child's really ill and needs to be in hospital, but the parents are being made to pay for upfront charges and they can't afford it? And then what would you, like, what are the options then? Because if you call social services, the child might end up being removed. But if you don't call, then the parents will probably self-discharge the child.
Yeah. Honestly, there isn't a like straightforward answer. What I would say is you need to plug them in with support services as early as possible. So places like Doctors of the World or contacting Medact. Often there's people who can potentially support. Talking to the family, talking to the child, and checking, making sure there's no vulnerabilities. And often you will find something that exempts them. Advocating if the care is urgent and immediately necessary, so writing that in your notes really clearly and having team discussions about that. And if your consultant decides, or whoever decides that's not the case, have a conversation about it and try and challenge it. And if it's immediately necessary, then it needs to be provided. They will be charged later, but at least you can save that child's life or whatever help for immediate needs. And yeah, as soon as possible if they start. So the other thing I would say is a lot of families are really scared. So overseas managers approach them and ask them for lots of details, and they get really scared to essentially say we've got no legal right to remain. But I would tell them to be as upfront as they can, because essentially what they do, overseas managers, is if they don't get the information they need, they call the Home Office themselves, and that automatically triggers an alert at the Home Office. So it makes that family known. So if they are upfront and clear about the information where they're at, if they can get legal advice about their immigration status, and there's very few free organizations, but Praxis is one of them, then they can, and there's lots of sort of local groups, so there's Hackney Migrant Group, and there's quite a few local areas that have a migrant support centre. If you can plug them into one of these, then they can start to explore their immigration status. And if they manage to apply for something, then that can, depending on what they apply for, that could potentially cancel the bill or defer it or something like that. And tell them to have conversations with the overseas managers about a payment plan. Any other thoughts, or anyone's come across cases or has other questions? And if anyone's interested in reading our study, it's in the edition of the BMJ Open of April. Sarah says, recently came across a case very suggestive of human trafficking, and the difficult part has been the young person involved does not disclose any concern. Yes, and that's always going to be really, really tricky. I think with children, it's slightly different, but all you can do is keep the door open, build a rapport, make sure that the child or their young person know that this is a safe space. And I've seen lots and lots of cases, particularly at Doctors of the World, of people who have come and didn't disclose anything. And we had one woman who came for, I think, about 2 or 3 months, used to just come every so often, sort of every other week or every week, and just sit. She didn't even ask for help with GP registration. She didn't ask for nearly anything. She used to just sit and watch and not do anything. And eventually, after quite a long time, she decided that she trusted this place and started to disclose things that had happened to her. And I'm sure it's only a tiny, tiny portion of the story, and she had been trafficked. But essentially, we need to trust that if we're treating people with respect and if we're empowering them, then at some point they will open up. Yes. So this is, so Janani's case, this is where it shows that the system is essentially not working, because the fact that this child couldn't or this young person couldn't register with GP and was sort of maybe not managed properly in ED because they didn't have a GP and they seemed like whatever, means that something was delayed, and it had an impact not just on them but on 6 other foster family members who ended up with TB as well. So it's quite significant, the effects that this has, and you have to think of the effects on this young person, on their family, and on any others they've been in contact with, particularly COVID time. Yes, I think the public health argument has been made quite a lot, but it doesn't seem to have worked. All right, any final thoughts? Might wrap up then and go and say goodnight to my kids. Thank you for listening. Oh, and please, just a couple of things. Remember to fill out the feedback form on SurveyMonkey. And the other thing to say is, for anyone who's interested in safeguarding, who's a trainee, mostly sort of level 2, level 3, we've got a trainee group for those interested in safeguarding. And pre-COVID, we used to meet once a month and discuss different safeguarding topics. So please, if any one of you is interested, email me and I will plug you into this group. It's really great. And at the moment, we're planning a conversation among ourselves in the next week or 2 about all our concerns on COVID and children who should be safeguarded and are not coming to our attention. Great, thanks everyone.